Oh boy.
Here we are, everybody.
Here we
I'm
go.
I'm Amelia,
Tom here.
and we're with GoTel Communications. It's a mom and pop ministry, us being the mom and pop, I guess. And we are in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14 this week. So Tom will tell us the story, and then we'll discuss it. Take it away, Tom.
This is the story. On one occasion, Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, and they were watching him closely. And when he saw that the guests were uh, sitting at the places of honor, he told them a parable. And he said to them, when you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, don't sit in the places of honor in case someone more distinguished than you is invited by your host. And since he has invited both of you and he comes to you and says, uh, excuse me, but give up your place. Uh, and you will then uh, look for the place that is the lowest at the table. But when you're invited to a wedding feast, take the lowest place so that when your host comes and sees you, he can say, friend, come up higher. And then you will be honored by all those who sit at table with you. For those who are honored and exalt themselves will be humbled, but those who are humbled will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your relatives, your brothers, or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you back and you will be repaid. But when you give a luncheon or a banquet or a dinner, invite the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame, for they cannot repay you. And then you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just and the righteous.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Tom. Um, yeah, being exalted and being humbled, I guess. It's a lot of that in this story. So we get the context in the story. Jesus is, let's see, he's going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees. So I guess that's kind of significant. And it's dinner time. And he tells them this parable. What's the context in the Gospel of Luke of the story? Where are we now? I mean, chapter 14, but what's go?
He's on his way up to Jerusalem and he's traveling. And what's significant about this is that we tend to think of the stories of Jesus and the Pharisees as conflict stories. But this reflects what was undoubtedly a major part of the context of this story in Jesus' context is that he was invited to dinners and luncheons uh, and that these were cordial events where they would discuss things. And so this is reflected in several stories in the gospel tradition of Jesus having a meal with Pharisees, who he was clearly in dialogue with, and it was often a friendly dialogue. Uh, so, I think that's the spirit of this story, uh, and rather than the conflict stories.
Okay. And it's kind of two different parts. First, Jesus tells a parable. That's the first part, about where you sit and where you ought to sit, all that. And
Yeah.
then another parable, and so that has kind of its own theme, I think, or point, or whatever, however you want to put it. Then the second, a little bit shorter part is about who you invite to your dinner banquet or your luncheon banquet. So with regard to that first section, well, actually, why don't you just talk a little bit about banquets first, since it's sort of all about eating with guests.
Well, this is a story of where Jesus tells another story to um, about a wedding banquet. Uh, so he is having a kind of low level, nice lunch, a meal, to which he was invited by this leading Pharisee. And so uh, the occasion that Jesus is talking about is then a place of reflection, of a wedding banquet, which was a big deal that happened very infrequently. And when it did, the whole town came out for celebration of the wedding. And those feasts were a big deal. So what Jesus is talking about is when you go to a wedding banquet, don't go and sit at the places of honor at the wedding banquet, which was a grand occasion. Because if you uh, take the high place and the seat of honor near the bride or near the groom and the guests at the head of the table, then it's quite possible that someone more distinguished than you comes and your host will ask you to sit at the to give your place up.
Right. And the story says you'd be disgraced if that's happening.
Yeah,
But I was asking a little more pragmatic question is, and actually I'm trying to visualize this. I mean, even if the whole town came, they're not all sitting at the same table, but how would it look for guests to be sitting at the table? It would be like we are today, or would it look different?
well, it probably would be that they'd all recline at the table.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they'd lie down on the floor and they have a cushion and they can reach in. Each person then reaches in to get something from the middle of the table where the food is put. And so,
So
and
it must have been a lower table then.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it was, you didn't sit like we sit at banquet tables, but rather there was a table of food in the middle and people would recline around the table. And so, uh,
Okay, okay, I think I get the picture now. Thank you. Right, sometimes they actually say while Jesus was reclining at table too, as I
yeah,
think about it. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay,
But
so he tells a parable. How is this story a parable?
well, it is a parable because it's a saying. It's a mashal. And there were various kinds of sayings, including what we think of as a parable and is named as that at a number of places, like the parable of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son or so on, which are kind of narrative parables. This is a collection of sayings that are then kind of wisdom sayings that Jesus, says in reflection of the person to whom he's speaking.
Oh, he said he has that important, significant one. The first will be last, and the last will be first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Well, it's repeated again at the end of the parable of the tax collector and the sinner.
Oh, okay.
The tax collector.
It's also in Matthew because I was looking at the story about the workers in the vineyard, and it's in that one too. So like
Yeah.
that must have been a significant saying that was recalled by the evangelists.
Right. And one that Jesus probably said more than once.
Yeah.
It was one of his themes. Uh,
So what's Jesus's recommendation about dinner behavior?
well, it's don't glorify yourself. Don't put yourself forward and uh, lift yourself up and exalt yourself by sitting at a place of honor at the bank.
Okay. And
And then
instead you should be what?
you should be humble and take a low place, and then there's the possibility that the host will say, "Come up higher at the table."
So it's kind of a pragmatic
Yeah.
self-interest thing, isn't it? Jesus appealing to our self-interest.
Well, and to the interest of every listener to be honored uh, rather than uh, told to take your place at a low.
Okay, moving on to that second, kind of the second section of this scripture lectionary offering. Jesus says, when you have a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Instead, invite the poor, I think you said maimed, um,
The blind and the lame.
yeah, the blind and the lame. Is that the anyway? How often do people do that? I mean, how often do we do that?
Uh, Good question. Now you're starting to meddle.
Yeah, Jesus is starting to meddle.
Yeah. Well, I expect it doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen.
In the literal sense, yeah, of having him over to your
I was
house.
going to self-examine myself, and how often. First of all, we don't have many dinners. When we do, we don't invite poor people,
Yeah,
and who would be uh, somewhat uncomfortable, perhaps. But uh, Jesus is saying, don't invite the people you would normally invite, your
yeah,
friends, relatives, and so on, but invite the people who can't repay you. And
right.
so it's
Yeah,
a very
I was thinking about how to, kind of how to get around that. So there are, well, like for example, in Dayton, we have a wonderful place called the House of Bread, which serves meals to poor people, to homeless people. So that's, that is a place where marginalized folks are invited to come and have a meal every day of the year, in fact.
yeah.
So being supportive of that kind of place might be a way to um, be in relationship with and be, I don't know, I'm not sure that the volunteers actually sit down at a meal. I have volunteered there, but it was I don't recall that I think we helped prepare the meal. I think we helped serve it, but I'm not sure we actually sat down with folks, which would be important, I think. So anyway, that's a thought I had about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's what Jesus is after. Is that it's an invitation to self-examination and policy, household policy in relation to dinners and how do we relate.
Okay, in my notes on this story, you had a saying from a rabbi that I think you wanted to mention. Yeah.
Well, it's an indication of the that this theme was present among rabbis other than Jesus, in addition to Jesus. So this is from,
At that time in history
well,
or following up?
probably later,
Okay.
uh, end of the first century, beginning of the second century.
Okay.
But it's clearly a theme that was present in the rabbinic teachings.
Okay.
So this saying of Rabbi Joseph ben Yohanan uh, is let your house be opened wide and let the needy be members of your household. Um, so it was a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, we
Just
often kind of conclude by asking how does a story relevant to ministries of peace and justice? That part feels pretty obvious how it would be relevant to um, not only share basics needs of food with people who need maybe can't afford, but also to be in relationship with them.
right.
Excellent. Yeah.
So that's one of the things that we can do in churches is invite people who are poor, uh, who are handicapped. And we do that.
Yeah.
Uh, and we have a few
Yeah.
folks who come.
At Grace. Yep.
So,
Yep. Well, and making your church building accessible would fall into that. Um, I think would be relevant to this scripture and saying also.
yes. I do want to give an example uh, of someone who Jesus would have recommended that we pay attention to, um, which was the Emperor Domitian, who was later than Jesus. Jesus, sometime in the early 30s. Domitian was in the late 70s and 80s, early 90s. Uh, he was uh, an emperor who, more than anyone else, glorified himself. Uh, he required that people who would come before him would address him as my Lord and my God. Uh, and uh, So he was known as one who glorified himself, who had great banquets in his own honor, uh, to which he invited people. And what happened was then when he died, he was so hated by even his colleagues in the Senate and in the aristocracy of Rome that they passed a law called the Damnatio Memoriae, uh, the damnation of memory, and that the law was that everything associated with Domitian was to be destroyed or covered over or limited. So the sayings that were carved into things, statues, whatever, anything that was associated with Domitian that they could get their hands on, they destroyed in order to humiliate him and his memory. Um, so it's an example of, uh, at a pretty radical level in the first century, uh, of someone who did exactly what Jesus does not recommend, who
Right.
glorified himself and was humbled
Right.
in memory.
Right. Right. And there are also, we've been reading kind of every day we read about somebody significant in Christian tradition, and a lot of them are people who um, had money, came from wealthy families, and felt called to leave their affluence um, and work to care for the poor, or in various ways, start hospitals, that kind of thing. So there are also examples of people who have humbled themselves, who've not sought glory for the sake of following this teaching of Jesus, I think.
Right.
Among others, I mean, this is not the only place where Jesus recommends humility. You mentioned the um, parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and that's certainly another place.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? That seems to me to be a good place to conclude today's Monday with Jesus.
Well, this is an example of the spirit of Jesus' teachings. And they aren't all confrontational things. They are cordial. Uh, these are, friendly recommendations uh, for participation in a way of life that can lead to the resurrection of the righteous. So,
Yeah, you might say Jesus took advantage of a teaching opportunity at this
right.
um, event, at this dinner at the house of a Pharisee. Okay, well, thanks for being with us, everybody. We'll um, see you next week. Bye.
Bye.